In this video, I will be carving tiny jack-o'-lanterns out of acorns. First, you'll need to get some acorns. The bigger the better. I'm guessing these ones are from a bur oak tree based on the furry edges around the caps. You will need to sand the top off each acorn. Make sure you're sanding the top, not the bottom. This is probably doable with just a piece of sandpaper, but it would take forever that way, so I would recommend using some kind of power sander. This one looks like it's been through something, but it'll do the job, after I've replaced the mangled paper on it. Whether you use a power sander or just a piece of sandpaper and a great deal of patience, you'll need to sand until you've exposed the light-colored inside of the acorn. At this point, you can start carving out the inside. You'll need to do this slowly and carefully. The shell of the acorn is thin and brittle, so it's easy to crack it if you use too much pressure while carving it out. Also, you're carving a small object that you're holding in your hand. Obviously, you don't want to slip and injure yourself. This is no time to be in a rush. I'm using a number 104 concave carving blade in my craft knife. A number 28 would probably work as well. The concave, curved shape will be particularly helpful later in this process. I'm also using this double-ended metal thingamajig that, as far as I know, is either a nut pick or some kind of manicure tool. I decided to try drilling it out with a ridged carving bit, but the heat from the friction just turned the inside of the acorn all gummy, so I wouldn't recommend it. So we're back to the thingamajig. Really, anything that's small enough to fit in the acorn, pointy enough to inflict damage, and strong enough to pry pieces out should do the job just fine. Once you've got the middle hollowed out, you can move on to the sides. This is where that narrow, curved blade comes in handy. With the sharp edge facing towards the middle, slide it in along the inside of the shell and begin slicing away the edge stuff. You'll mostly just be chipping away at it to begin with, but once you have a little gap cleared along the side, you can begin slicing larger chunks off, and they'll have some wiggle room to break away from the side. Try not to pry at stubborn chunks with the craft knife. The thin blades can be broken under pressure. It's better to set it down and use something else as a prying tool. I probably should have tried some other shapes of craft knife just to see how they would work, but I really liked how this one was working, and so I just went ahead with it. It would also be interesting to try some of those little tiny saws that they sell for carving pumpkins. Maybe they would also work for gutting acorns. Who knows? The nut pick, or whatever pokey thing is available, is good for scraping away the stuff at the bottom. Once half the acorn is completely cleaned out, it should be fairly easy to remove the rest in just a few large chunks. Once it's all cleaned out, you can finally move on to the carving. Side note, This one cracked while I was hollowing it out, and the crack grew from hairline to noticeable gap in a very short time. Something about the structure of acorn shells makes cracks spread over time. Also, there's a papery layer on the inside that you can remove if you want, but it's not totally necessary. Unless you want to try carving freehand, this is the point where you draw your design on the acorn. To do this, I used an extra fine point Sharpie. Try not to get any ink outside of the areas you plan to cut out. It's a porous enough surface that it doesn't really come off, even if you scrub at it with rubbing alcohol. With pumpkins, you can do shaded designs by cutting only part way through. You can't do that with acorns, so keep your design fairly simple and don't get too fine with the details. Also, don't get too attached to Turnip Head here. He didn't make it to the end of the process. I'm using diamond burr bits to do the carving, a small cone-shaped one and a very small cylinder-shaped one. Keen-eyed viewers might notice that there are already holes in the acorn I'm working on here. My camera wasn't recording. The best approach I found for carving designs was to drill holes as large as possible in all the areas that need cut out, and then use the cylinder-shaped bit to ream out the rest of the shape. Go slowly, and don't push the acorn into the bit too aggressively. I would love to play some music from Nightmare Before Christmas while carving out this Jack Skellington face, but I don't want to get copyright struck, so you're stuck listening to the dulcet tones of the Dremel. To make long, thin lines, drill a tiny starting hole, then use the cylinder bit to cut slowly out from it, following the line. Some details are easier to freehand than if you tried to draw them first, because you can make small adjustments to allow for the width of the bit without leaving behind unsightly Sharpie lines if they end up not being where you needed to cut. Here I'm using a craft knife blade to make the nostril holes into teardrop shapes. You can use Dremel bits or small files to clean up the edges of the holes or to create straight lines and sharp corners. I wanted a non-permanent way to attach the cap and didn't have time to mess with epoxy and magnets, so I'm using a chunk of soft wax to hold the two pieces together while I drill stringing holes on both sides of the acorn so I can put them on a piece of fishing line. I used a regular drill bit to do this, not one of the diamond burrs. All that's left to do now is to string them onto the fishing line with some mini LED lights and some beads to keep the lights centered. These were listed as balloon lights, but you could also use fairy lights or small Christmas lights to illuminate your tiny jack-o'-lanterns. The lights I'm using will be flashing when I switch them on in just a moment. This whole held together with fishing line approach to assembly is not ideal, but this was a last-minute project that I wanted to post before Halloween was over, so it's good enough. And by last minute, I mean that I thought of this the night before last, and I had a day and a half for making, filming, and editing. I really need to plan ahead better. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all had a fun Halloween.